Okay. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I can't tell if you're paying attention or not. Good afternoon. Welcome back. I really hope you all enjoyed your afternoon breakout sessions. I had the opportunity to sit on a couple of them, and it really enforced the significance of representation, of holistic support, community collaborations in fostering inclusive environments. Now we're in for a special treat. I'm honored to introduce our plenary session of the day, Antisemitism, Democracy, and the Struggle for an Inclusive and Resilient America. We have the distinct honor to have incredible thought leaders with us today, and this session is moderated by UW professor John Zumbrinen, who studies the history of political thought, democratic theory, and American political thought. He also holds the titles of Senior Vice Provost for Academic Affairs and Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. The panel will explore the inextricable link between Jewish safety, our democratic freedoms, and the resilience of our interconnected communities. Please join me in welcoming Professor Zumbrinen, who will introduce our panel.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Charleston, and thanks to all of you for being here for an important conversation. I'm actually going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves here in a moment before I pose the first question. But since I have the floor, I just want to offer a couple opening thoughts of my own. I've been reflecting on the theme of this year's Diversity Forum, Threads of Belonging. And for me, the different sort of resonances or valences that notion of threads of belonging have, and I've focused in particular on the word threads. I think of thread as something that connects us. In fact, there's the language of connection in the Diversity Forum title. So I think of connection when I think of threads. I also notice that there's an S at the end, so it is threads, and there I have in mind the theme running throughout many of these 2 days' conversations of pluralism. And I think as we begin a conversation this afternoon about Jewish identity and anti-Semitism, we're very much operating in the space of pluralism. If you look at the Diversity Forum agenda, you'll see that there's another panel tomorrow afternoon on Jewish identity. If we're thinking broadly of the events in the world that have impacted Jewish people over the last year, we know that there's a tragedy continuing to unfold in the Middle East. We know that affects other peoples as well. And so I just want to also call your attention to a panel tomorrow morning on Islamophobia. I think it's appropriate to mention those other sessions in that spirit of the S at the end of threads. It's working in the context of pluralism. And I'll confess that the other thing I thought about when I read the language of threads of belonging is a saying we have sometimes of hanging by a thread. And I think about the fact that a thread, while it can hold us together in connection, can also be thin and tenuous. And it is surely the case over the last year plus that belonging has at times felt quite tenuous for many members of our campus community and our broader communities and our world. And so just sitting with that tenuousness this afternoon, and I think it brings us together from a variety of different experiences and points of view to engage with what I think is an incredibly important topic. So with that, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor and a privilege to be here. My name is Amy Spitalnik. I am the CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, which is an 80-year-old national Jewish organization founded during a very dark time for the Jewish community, during the end of World War II, specifically recognizing that Jewish safety in America was inextricably linked with other communities' rights and safety, and with the fight for an inclusive democracy, and that we would only be safe as Jews if we were working across communities to build the relationships, the coalitions that we need to fight for all of our safety. My own background is in really exploring this intersection. Before I joined JCPA, I led an organization where we brought a successful lawsuit against the neo-Nazis and white supremacists responsible for the violence in Charlottesville in 2017, where we took to court 24 of the most prominent extremists in the country to the tune of $26 million verdict, and have spent a lot of time working both within the Jewish community and the democracy and anti-extremism space on the intersection of anti-Semitism and democracy, including publishing a report earlier this year on anti-Semitism and democracy. I'll largely leave it there and just add, particularly given the moment that we're at as a country, before doing this work, I spent a lot of time in government, including in the New York Attorney General's office during the first Trump administration, where we were really on the front lines of the legal fights against everything from the Muslim ban and the DACA repeal to so much more. And so as we gear up for what's coming in January, I'm really reflecting on a lot of the lessons and experiences from 8 years ago and the work that we did there, because as we think about anti-Semitism, democracy, and an inclusive America, we know that that fight is going to be more important than ever in the months ahead. And so I'll leave it there, and I'm really grateful to be here.
Hi, I am Ilana Khan. It's so nice to be with you. I am Executive Director of the Illinois Commission on Discrimination and Hate Crimes, which is a governor-appointed advisory commission that sits within the Illinois Department of Human Rights. And it's a young commission, but not really, because it was started in 1999, and then in the mid-2000s fell apart because of conflict between the commissioners over the kinds of issues that all of us are accustomed to now. And it was revived under Governor Pritzker in 2021, and I'm the first executive director since then. And we are working to strengthen responses to hate, meaning also to have better definitions of what are we talking about when we talk about hate, but to have stronger responses so that people who experience acts of hate are supported, law enforcement officers know how to respond without re-traumatizing folks, et cetera. And also to build a landscape of preventative programs. And I come to this work after 20 years as a Jewish communal professional. I did the work that the Jewish I was director of the Jewish Community Relations Council in Milwaukee, which was the sort of the local expression, the local organization that worked on issues like JCPA. JCPA was our national friend. So we did a lot of interfaith, intergroup relations, worked on justice issues, a lot of anti-Semitism, and the same idea that we cannot be safe alone. We are only safe when we, I would say actually, with the idea, the image of the thread, that when you braid thread together, it is almost unbreakable.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm really honored to be here with John and Amy and Ilana. My name is Chad Allen Goldberg. I'm a faculty member here at Madison. I'm Martindale Bascom Professor of Sociology. I've been on the faculty for about 23 years. In addition to having a position in the sociology department, I have an appointment by courtesy in the history department, and I'm also affiliated with the Mossie Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies. I'm a political sociologist and a historical sociologist. Among the things that I have studied over the years is anti-Semitism. I have written and published about anti-Semitism since 2008. I also teach a course on the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, teaching it this semester, in fact. And I have tried to involve myself in public education about the issues that we'll talk about today through interviews with Wisconsin Public Radio, Wisconsin Public Television, and other media outlets. So very happy to be here for what I think will be a very important conversation.
And again, thank you all so much for being here for this conversation this afternoon. Our panel, our session description starts off by saying a healthy democracy requires that we stand against hate and extremism. And I want to start off by chatting just a minute about that notion of healthy democracy. So I'm curious what that means to you all. When you think about democracy, what it means for it to be healthy, what's that call to mind for you?
the term democracy, particularly over the last few years, has really been painted as almost a controversial or even partisan term. And the fact that that is where we're at is perhaps one of the biggest examples or symptoms of what we're here to talk about. Democracy, to me, and I would hope to everyone, simply means a society in which all of us are able to live as our authentic selves safely and freely, without fear of violence, without fear of bigotry, without fear of our rights being assaulted because of who we are or what we believe or how we show up in this world. And it's so important to understand that at the core of efforts to attack our democracy are so often conspiracy theories, disinformation, and lies rooted in bigotry that's intended to pit communities against one another. Because the way that democracy fractures is by pitting communities against one another so that we can't build the coalitions we need to fight back against rising extremism and attacks on inclusive democracy. And so, as I'm sure we'll unpack over the next hour, the role in which anti-Semitism and other forms of hate play, and increasingly normalized anti-Semitism and hate play, in fueling and animating broader attacks on democracy and dehumanization and so much more, is really impossible to separate from the broader conversation on democracy. And so too, as our democratic norms erode, as the rule of law erodes, as we see this sort of extremism become normalized, it creates the conditions for hate, including anti-Semitism, but all forms of hate, to further flourish. Because again, communities are being pit against one another. These conspiracy theories are being used to sow distrust in our institutions and the rule of law and the basic tenets of democracy. And we end up in this feedback loop in which the hate and the bigotry and the dehumanization leads to democracy's erosion, and democracy's erosion further normalizes the hate and the bigotry and the dehumanization. Mm-hmm. We got to break that cycle if we're actually going to create an inclusive America.
Mm-hmm. That was perfect. I would just add, sort of coming down to the ground level, as I think about, we're so tribal that we sometimes can't see things outside how our tribe sees them. And if I think about, like, what are the institutions of democracy, of course, voting rights. And we should be mindful about, what are the efforts to erode voting rights, rights to privacy, regulations that protect citizens. At the Department of Human Rights, we're so mindful of conflicts of interest. You wouldn't believe what I had to go through in order to agree to come to speak at this university as a state employee. Like, is there a conflict? We're so thoughtful, and so thinking, like, what conflicts of interest, thinking ahead. Let's be mindful of what, let's see what is happening truly. So I think also the idea of not too much power in the hands of too few. That's one of the sort of on the ground things that I'm looking for. I also think that one of the, as we get down to sort of human being, individual level, how we engage in conflict with each other, to me, is a reflection of if a society is healthy or not. Generally, healthy communities, democracies are able to engage in healthy conflict. That might be painful, it might be difficult, but is generally productive, like leads somewhere else. And I think one more thing, I think on sort of individual consciousness, in a healthy society, people generally, not every single person, see each other as actors or agents of their future rather than victims.
My answer, John, will have a lot of overlap, I think, with what Amy and Ilana said. I would emphasize or hit on a lot of the same things. I think, as a political theorist, that when we talk about democracy, I think a healthy democracy is a particular type of democracy. It is, among other things, a liberal democracy. And so what I heard and what Amy and Ilana said was an emphasis on those elements of liberalism that include the rule of law, the protection of rights, individual rights and minority rights. I think that's an important component of what a healthy democracy looks like, so I agree with them about that. And the other thing I was going to say that sort of dovetails very nicely with what Amy and Ilana said, I think of the work of my colleague, Jeffrey Alexander, who's a sociologist who has written about how, in his view, a healthy democracy requires something that he calls civil solidarity, which is a kind of broad, universalizing kind of solidarity that doesn't exclude people on the basis of their religion or their race or their ethnicity or their national origins and all those other things that so frequently are used to divide us. So that, again, sort of echoes what Amy and Ilana said. The only thing I would maybe add is when I think about democracy, I always think about John Dewey. And Dewey was somebody who thought about democracy as a form of collective and cooperative problem solving. I think that's a really important dimension of a healthy democracy. Cooperative problem solving requires active participation. We can't be passive citizens if democracy requires cooperative problem solving. And it requires good communication skills. We have to be able to talk to one another, to communicate with one another in a way that's not distorted. That vision, I think, of democracy as cooperative problem solving, I think is also at the heart of a tradition that has long been valued and treasured here at the University of Wisconsin, which is shared governance. I think that's the vision behind shared governance as well, that we want everybody at the table to think together, to work together, to solve the problems that we jointly face.
Great, thank you all. Our session title continues, A Healthy Democracy Requires That We Stand Against Hate and Extremism. I'm struck by a kind of aside, I think I heard you say, Ilana, that you wish we had better definitions of hate, right? And so, you know, in listening to your answers about the meaning of democracy, here a real focus on threats to democracy coming from attempts to divide people, in part based on hate. So I'm gonna make the moderator foul of asking two questions at once, I fear. One is just to ask for reflections on how it is that hate and extremism threaten democracy. But then also, how do we think about disagreement in democracy? Because we surely are divided over some things, and that too is part of democracy. So I suppose in some ways I'm asking how you think about the difference between healthy disagreement and the kind of division and hate that threaten healthy democracy.
Should we just go down, or do you want to? Please.
So interesting, the thing about hate is that we have worked hard to, I feel like I'm proselytizing definitions of hate. Most of our world, when we talk about hate, we're not talking about like cilantro or things like that, like your feelings about things. I like cilantro, but I didn't used to. But we're talking about, when we think about it in terms of hate crimes or the world of hate incidents, we're talking about having bias against people based on their identities. Like, pretty simple. And we organize it and this is just sort of a preface. There are sort of three types of hate. There are hate crimes, which are easy to understand because they're defined by law. There has to be a crime and it has to be driven by bias. And the bias against the protected identity, the protected class is listed in the law, as are the crimes. That's one thing. And then there is what's generally not criminal, but sometimes civil rights violations that are like, we don't serve people who, you know, someone in a restaurant not serving somebody because of the language that they speak, or not giving someone a promotion because they're LGBT, or you know what I mean by discrimination, harassment. And then there are the things that we live in a robust democracy with First Amendment rights, the things that are legal. You're allowed to walk down the street and yell slurs at people if you're not threatening them. So that's sort of the landscape as we think about hate. Acts of hate, no matter where they are in that landscape, threaten the democracy because they are message acts. They're acts that communicate that people don't belong. And they harm communities. They leave community, not just individuals, but the communities to which they belong. They leave them often with trauma, often afraid to get involved in public life. Like, they harm our democracy. And they exacerbate tribalism. Tribalism is inherently not bad, actually. It's probably an evolutionary success, or a need anyway. But it gets distorted, of course, and misapplied. And so we see tribalism all around, people who vote against their own self-interest because they feel that they belong to this group. Those people, or even I think about, like, I wouldn't usually do this, but those people. I mean, I think it's this sort of tribalism is so defines this era. And I think on a personal level, you were talking about it a little bit, it leads people to, like sort of social erosion leads people to turn against each other. So I was really struck by a book that came out a few years ago called High Conflict by Amanda Ripley. And there are more and more people talking about high conflict as distinct from healthy conflict. So healthy conflict, of course, is where you can disagree, but it's productive, and it can be painful, it can be intense, but your point is to get somewhere else, is to resolve it. And high conflict, and I would guess that we all have in our lives high conflict as people who participate in it and as people who maybe feel targeted by it. But it's self-perpetuating, perhaps most identifiable by by seeing the conflict as a binary, like good versus evil. Like there is no nuance. These people are evil. I wouldn't usually behave this way, but I have to. I have few options. I have no options except to fight. In high conflict, we are sure that we're the righteous ones. We are often very defensive, of course. We make assumptions about the people on the other sides of issues. We, like I said, think we have no choice but to fight. We don't see the options ahead of. We don't see the options. We have this sort of narrow field of vision. And one of the most identifiable things about high conflict is that we find ourselves wanting to humiliate the other side. And that, of course, is not what you do when you're trying to resolve conflict. Because there is no total victory in real life. I mean, generally, there's no winning except living together. Like, real life, like healthy community is not satisfying to the person who wants total victory. Maybe I will, I'll say one more thing. That today, the moral leadership that I'm so hungry for today, that I think we need today, demands a reframing, because we are so deep in high conflict and misinformation. So to me, moral leadership requires reframing, reminding us not to fall for all of the stimuli around us that are sort of, encouraging us to be like ginning us up, encouraging us to clench our hands and fight back. Maybe I will stop there. So
the two parts to your question, John. I think the first part is easier to answer. So, the first part was how does hate and extremism threaten a healthy democracy? We've just talked about the things that we see as important for a healthy democracy. So, for example, if rights and the rule of law are an important part of a healthy democracy, I think hatred and extremism clearly threaten the rights of individuals and minorities. This is a very obvious way in which hatred and extremism can undermine, jeopardize a healthy democracy. Certainly we see that with anti-Semitism when hatred is directed at Jews, but what starts with Jews rarely ends with Jews and often spreads to other kinds of groups. So I'm reminded 2 years ago there was a mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. The perpetrator of that mass shooting had left an online manifesto calling for the murder of Jews, but most of the victims of that mass shooting were Black Americans, actually, and that's no accident. So what starts with Jews rarely ends with Jews, and this is an extreme instance of how individual rights and protections and safety are threatened by hatred and extremism. Of course, hatred and extremism it limits, it restricts civil solidarity. It replaces it with more narrow forms of solidarity based on qualities that not all citizens share. So white nationalism or Christian nationalism would be examples of these kinds of things. Limits the reach of our civil solidarity. And then maybe the last thing I would say is that and this sort of goes to the second part of your question about how to handle conflict. And I think that you put it just right, because it's not realistic to think that in a society as large, as complex, as complicated as ours, that there are not going to be conflicts, or that we can avoid conflicts, or even to think that conflict is undesirable. I think that conflict actually can be healthy and can be a positive thing. All depends, as John said, on how it's handled, how we deal with that. Ilana talked just now about some healthier ways to deal with conflict. It seems to me that what I worry about is conflicts that become suffused with conspiratorial thinking, with what the historian Richard Hofstadter once called the paranoid style in American politics, that kind of Manichaeism that Ilana talked about, of sort of this is a battle between absolute good and absolute evil, where all the good is on one side and all the evil is on the other, and of course scapegoating. Those ways of handling conflict, it seems to me, denigrate ordinary democratic processes. They undermine trust in democratic institutions and solutions. They give the idea that democracy is somehow fake or ersatz, and it hampers our ability to find real solutions to the problems that face us if that's how we're trying to resolve conflicts.
That's so interesting.
I wholeheartedly agree with so much of what's been said, and I want to sort of take maybe the higher level analysis of how hate fuels rollbacks of democracy and talk about it in very specific terms that I know are top of mind for many of us right now. And I'm going to use anti-Semitism as sort of the example, but as you'll see, anti-Semitism is inextricably linked with other forms of hate that are in turn fueling these direct attacks on our democracy. So anti-Semitism, and we're going to talk about this more later, is of course a form of prejudice, bigotry, hating Jews because of who they are. And also at its core, it's this pernicious, insidious conspiracy theory rooted in tropes around control and power. Jews being a puppet master controlling something, and we'll talk more about this. Many of you, maybe some of you were young, but I think many of us still know those images from Charlottesville 7 years ago of Nazis with torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Who are Jews replacing? These Nazis were chanting, "Jews will not replace us," and this is the very same conspiracy theory that has fueled a cycle of mass violence in Pittsburgh and Poway, in El Paso targeting the Latino community, in Buffalo targeting the Black community, and so many other places. It's this idea that Jews are orchestrating the replacement of the white race, of the white electorate, or of what these extremists and white supremacists believe this country should fundamentally be, which does not include anyone who is outside of the white Christian heteronormative vision for America. And we see this not just in the cycle of violence that I just talked about, but we also see it become increasingly normalized in our politics and our society in very specific ways that are having very real policy implications. You hear it, for example, in the anti-immigrant dehumanization that has become so normalized. Jews are orchestrating the replacement of the white race by supporting immigrants and refugees coming up from the southern border. George Soros funding a caravan of migrants is one of these frequent tropes. The Pittsburgh synagogue, which was targeted by a white supremacist in 2018, was targeted, the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in US history, was targeted not just because it was Jewish, but also because they work with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which supports refugees of all backgrounds coming to the United States. And so we see this anti-Semitic conspiracy theory fueling not just attacks against Jews, not just attacks against Latinos and the Black community and others, but actual anti-immigrant policies. We see it in the assault on voting rights, including these ideas that Jews, oftentimes George Soros, his name is evoked again, over and over again in these contexts, but Jews are seeking to replace the electorate by supporting Black and brown people, illegally voting. We heard it. Very direct echoes of it on January 6th at the Capitol, where there was both, white supremacist paraphernalia, Confederate flags and otherwise, and explicit anti-Semitic paraphernalia, including a Camp Auschwitz shirt that I think got a lot of attention. We see it in attacks on reproductive rights related to birth rates and how Jews are conspiring to replace the white race by reducing birth rates, or by their support for the LGBTQ community. You can go on and on the ways in which these conspiracy theories are so normalized in a way that leads to the direct policies that fundamentally undercut our rights, our democracy, and harm all of us. And as I mentioned earlier, it's also manifesting in a way that is intended to divide the coalitions we need to in turn fight back against that assault on democracy. It's fundamentally anti-democratic, not just to roll back people's rights in the ways we just talked about and use hate to do so, but also to try to divide these coalitions by saying, well, maybe Jews are not welcome in these coalitions. You need to check your identity at the door, or any other person is not welcome in these spaces or these coalitions. What that does is fundamentally divide us at a time when we need to be building the broadest possible coalitions to protect all of us. And that is a core tool of extremism. And so we need to be clear-eyed about how there are very real forces seeking, again, to divide our communities so that this hate-fueled attack on democracy can't be countered in the way that we so desperately need to.
Following along the lines of, I think, that you started this down, Amy, of digging into some of the particularities of anti-Semitism and then its connections to other forms of hate. And Chad, I'm thinking in particular, I know you study and teach about the history of anti-Semitism. So what do you find is different about this moment, if anything? How has anti-Semitism changed over time? Is there something particular about the moment we're in now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that I would make maybe a few points about anti-Semitism. So one, I think, is it is important to recognize that this is a form of hatred and bigotry that has been called the longest hatred because it has been around for centuries, and no hatred exists for that long without changing, without mutating and taking different forms, right? And we see that historically. So in the course on the history of anti-Semitism that I teach here at UW-Madison, we talk about the many different forms that it has taken over centuries. So if you sort of look in antiquity, in the ancient world, I would say that hostility or antagonism to Jews was really xenophobic. It was a form of fear of difference, and it was a kind of reaction to the refusal of Jews to adopt the religion customs of the societies around them. In the Middle Ages, or even before that, really, in the early centuries of the Common Era, you get a new form of animosity toward Jews, which is a kind of Christian religious anti-Semitism. It's based in Christian theology. It's based in the idea that Jews are responsible for killing Jesus. It sort of mutates in all kinds of bizarre ways in the Middle Ages. That's where we get the blood libel, this bizarre and unfounded accusation that Jews use the blood of Christian children for religious rituals. So, but here it really takes a religious form. And then in the 19th century, you get the emergence of yet a new form. Anti-Semitism becomes secular, and it takes a racialized form. So in the late 19th century, you've got this guy, Wilhelm Marr in Germany, who coins the term, who coins the word anti-Semitism to differentiate his hatred from the old religious Christian anti-Judaism of the past, to describe his hatred as modern and scientific and based on what he saw as kind of the racial science, pseudoscience, I would say, of the time. So it's something that takes different forms, it mutates. Nevertheless, I think there are certain common elements that we see. Some of those we've touched on already. Amy talked about this idea of Jewish power and Jewish control. I think this is a thread that runs through a lot of the history of anti-Semitism, the idea that Jews are somehow in control of major institutions, whether it's the banks or the government or the media, that they control things behind the scenes for nefarious purposes. What are those purposes? The other element, of course, always this common element, that Jews are seen as using their supposed power for evil. Jews become then the scapegoat for all kinds of social misfortunes, social disasters. And also, I would say anti-Semitism is distinctive in that you often see contradictory ideas about Jews as part of the history of anti-Semitism. Jews are communists, but they're also capitalists. They're also, sort of international bankers. Jews are clannish, but they're also globalists and cosmopolitans, right? So you get these contradictory ideas about Jews. It means that whatever somebody doesn't like about their society, it gets coded as Jewish, and Jews stand in for that, which means that anti-Semitism then appears on both sides of the political spectrum. People that I talk to who are politically conservative, they're really good at spotting anti-Semitism on the left. People on the left are really good at spotting it on the right, but nobody ever wants to see it on the side of the political spectrum where they themselves are situated or positioned. The contradictory nature of anti-Semitism means that it appears on both of these sides. Now, in terms of the current moment, the thing that, the major reason that we are all here and having this conversation is that I think there's very clear evidence that in the last decade, at least in the United States, anti-Semitism has been on the rise. It's on the rise in the US, and it's on the rise around the world. We know that in lots of different ways. The Anti-Defamation League, this venerable civil rights organization that was founded in 1913 to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry, they have collected and reported data on anti-Semitic incidents since 1979. So we've got a kind of baseline going back to 1979. The sort of short story here is that after a decrease in anti-Semitism beginning around 2004 to about 2013, their data shows a sharp rise in 2014, and the general trend since then has been upward. Last year, the number of anti-Semitic incidents, assaults, vandalism, harassment sort of broke all previous records in terms of reported incidents. If you don't trust the ADL, maybe you'll trust the FBI. The FBI, of course, collects data on hate crimes. The FBI director testified in a US Senate hearing at the end of October last year that anti-Semitism had reached, in his words, historic levels in the United States. According to FBI statistics released just 2 months ago, anti-Semitic hate crimes in the US surged 63% last year, the highest on record, the highest on record. So this is the thing I think that is a cause of great concern for many of us, is this ongoing and sharp rise in anti-Semitic violence and harassment and vandalism and so on.
I want to come in a moment, certainly before we close, and our time, of course, is flying by. I want to come in a moment to ask what individuals and institutions might do in the context of increasing anti-Semitism. I want first, though, and for those of you, I'm going to meld in some Q&A here as we go. And you'll find on your table, you'll see a QR code there in the middle that you can scan and provide your question. And some folks are already providing questions. So I want to hear you all speak to this question. It's the first one that came in. It engages with the question of the relationship between anti-Semitism, Zionism, and the State of Israel. So I'll just read the question for you. When anti-Zionism as the critique of Israel is mistaken for anti-Semitism, bias against Jewish folks, the diversity of the Jewish people is erased. How do we make space in the academy? I think we can broaden that to in our communities altogether for Jewish folks who are advocating for Palestinian lives. So there's a particular question about Palestinian lives there, and then I think as well a broader question about the relationship between anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and critiques of Israel. So.
Yeah. Look, I think it's helpful to start this, and look, this is the elephant in the room, right? We need to confront the elephant in the room if we're actually going to understand anti-Semitism, if we're actually going to all move towards a world in which peace for Israelis and Palestinians are possible, and if Jews, Muslims, Arab Americans, or anyone else is going to be safe on campus and in our society, period. I want to start this by actually talking about what Zionism means to me, because I think the term itself has become so twisted in the public conversation that no single person has the same definition of Zionism as the person sitting next to them. Zionism, to me, and I would say probably to a lot of American Jews, simply means belief in Jewish self-determination, that there should be a Jewish homeland, potentially, or in many cases, in a place where there are deep Jewish historical ties, and that that homeland should be both Jewish and democratic. For me, that Zionism goes not only hand in hand, but is existentially linked to my belief in Palestinian self-determination and the need for a two-state solution that also provides Palestinians with dignity and the humanity that they deserve and that protects the lives and security of both the Israeli and Palestinian people. Full stop. Now, for other people, Zionism might be interpreted differently, right? I think in a lot of the public conversation, particularly since October 7th last year, Zionism is really seen as support for what the Israeli government itself is doing, for Benjamin Netanyahu, for the actions of the Israeli Defense Forces, for what's happening in Gaza. And this is where it gets messy, because if you actually look at what the vast majority of American Jews and what Americans writ large believe, our feelings about all of that are quite complicated. We have a saying in the Jewish community, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and that's certainly true when it comes to Israel. And And I will say, for all of the, as someone who sort of sits in the intersection that I sit in, I see this on a daily basis from those on my right who call me a self-hating Jew or a capo, which was a Jew who collaborated with the Nazis, for believing in Palestinian self-determination, for working across communities, for believing that Islamophobia and anti-Arab hate is real and that we need to fight it just as much as we need to fight anti-Semitism. The same way that I am sometimes called a genocidal Zionist by people on my left for believing that Israel should exist as a Jewish homeland side by side with a Palestinian homeland. And so we need to actually start speaking the same language to have this conversation. You asked about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and how they intersect. In theory, I don't believe that anti-Zionism is inherently anti-Semitic. The way that it is manifesting in specific ways over the last year, in practice, has had very specific anti-Semitic implications. And I want to unpack this in a deliberate way. 80 to 90% of American Jews have a relationship with Israel. Again, it's in the way that I described. It doesn't mean that they support the actions of the Israeli government or would vote for Benjamin Netanyahu. It doesn't mean that they support a lot of what's happening right now. Some do, many don't if you look at the polling. But what it does mean is that Jews have a connection, a relationship to Israel, to that land, to the belief in Jewish self-determination and a Jewish homeland. And so when we start hearing things like ban Zionists from campus, or Zionist authors, boycott Zionist authors or musicians or artists, what that effectively translates to in practice, even if it's not what's meant in spirit, is to say ban and boycott 80 to 90% of American Jews who have this relationship. Mm-hmm. And so we can have deep, real disagreements over Israeli policy, over the future of the region, over what the IDF and the Israeli government is doing. But we need to do so from a place that recognizes the humanity, not just of both people in the regions neither of whom are going anywhere. Israelis are not going anywhere and Palestinians are not going anywhere, and we need a solution that recognizes that. So too do we need to recognize that Jews, Muslims, and Arab Americans here are not going anywhere. And as we debate and talk about this and protest things that we want to protest, as you have a fundamental right to do, we do so in a way that doesn't lose sight of the humanity of any people engaged in this conversation. And it's complicated, and it's messy, and it's hard. But we need to understand and start from a place of shared understanding and definitions if we're even going to then be able to have the conversations that lead to the sort of inclusive future we want on campus more broadly and when it comes to the Middle East itself. It's not a perfect answer, and there's so much more to say about this, and we could probably have 17 panels about this alone. But I think it's really important to ground how we understand this in starting from a place of shared understanding of what this language and these identities even mean for American Jews and for others.
I would just add, so much that was so good. I would add that the community is really struggling, actually really struggling, and there's a shortage of grace. Just on a human level, I feel like a different person than I felt like on October 6th last year. Just to get personal, my daughter lives in Israel, and my niece was murdered on October 7th. And I'm in the position of being executive director of a commission that is inherently diverse. We have people in leadership positions representing various communities. We attempt to reflect the diversity of the state of Illinois. Of course, we don't succeed, but that's the effort. And so that means that among our commissioners, we have Jews of European descent. We have, there's a Muslim whose family's from India, so a South Asian Muslim, and we have an Arab Christian. And it's been challenging, actually. And one of the ways, I spent years doing this sort of work, and I got there and I was like, I'm not going to have to do this anymore. And then October 7th happened, and the way that we have managed to to continue existing, not to fall apart essentially, is by first of all focusing on what's happening in our community. That's not a perfect answer too, because it is worthwhile, possible and worthwhile to debate the issues and build a healthier community by being inclusive. But we've really grounded ourselves, frankly, in shared pain. And we've said, okay, if at some point we will be able to talk about these issues. At this point, we care about the communities that live here. We care about each other. We're going to continue to care about each other. And we will see each other's pain. So I feel like there's sort of a basic humanness that we just keep coming back to. So that's a different facet, but that's my piece.
I think these were absolutely terrific answers. I agree with both of these answers fully. If I was going to add anything to this, I would maybe just add, first of all, that something about the relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism. We talked about this current time, our time, being a period in which anti-Semitism was on the rise. The late 19th century was also a period of rising anti-Semitism in Europe, and Zionism was fundamentally a response to anti-Semitism. People who didn't start out with this idea, but were really at a loss for how else to protect Jewish communities from violence and from discrimination in Europe at the end of the 19th century, and were driven to the idea that the best way and the only way to do that really was to establish a Jewish homeland where Jews could defend themselves and have some kind of self-determination, as Amy said. I want to point out, secondly, Zionism is itself a very diverse movement historically. It is not monolithic. There were intense disagreements among Zionists about ends and about means. And so when you hear people talking about Zionism in a very generalized way, probably means they're not very familiar with this history. Third point I would make here is that what do we mean when we talk about anti-Zionism? Anti-Zionism is not just criticism of Israel, right? If by anti-Zionism you mean criticism of Israel, I would say you're misusing the word, because Israelis are very critical of Israel. Just last year, there were mass protests in Israel against the current government, which is a very right-wing government.
There still is.
And there still are. There still are, right? So anti-Zionism doesn't mean that you're critical of Israel. Anti-Zionism means that you think Jews don't deserve to have a homeland and don't deserve self-determination. That's something very different and something very much more specific. And the last thing I'll say is that it's true. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same thing. We shouldn't conflate them. I agree with that, right? But they are related. And there is sociological research. There's work by sociologists and by political scientists that has shown that there is a correlation between anti-Semitic attitudes and anti-Zionist attitudes. That if you have the one attitude, you are more likely to have the other attitude. There's research to show that. They're also related in the sense that while criticism of Israel is certainly not anti-Semitic in and of itself, it becomes anti-Semitic when it becomes suffused with anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes. So just a moment ago, we were talking about this trope of Jewish power, right? These conspiratorial views of Jews controlling the government, controlling the banks, controlling the media. If the only difference is that instead of saying Jews do all that, you say it's the Zionists, that might be an indication that your anti-Israel criticism is sliding over into anti-Semitism, right? So there are certainly ways to criticize the current Israeli government, to criticize its policies, to criticize the state of Israel that are not anti-Semitic, but we also need to be cognizant of how we do that to make sure that we don't cross that line into voicing criticisms that take an anti-Semitic form.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
We've just got a couple minutes left, and I do want to turn to what we might do, and I think you all have already begun to speak to that. I'm really struck, Ilana, by your statement of gathering around shared pain, which I think as a response to incredibly difficult moments is certainly understandable, and Shirley too, and I heard this in what you were saying, is hoping for a future that's something more than that, certainly. So I wonder if each of you might share briefly something that you think might happen at a university like ours to engage with and address anti-Semitism, threats to democracy, or the kinds of divisions that I think, you spoke to the elephant in the room, Amy, that we might do to address those kinds of divisions. So.
Look, I'll say two things. Lean into the hard conversations and don't let them divide us. On the first, this is something that each and every person in this room can do. Find the person who lives down the hall from you, the person in the class, that you know you have fundamentally different opinions, whether it's on Israel or something else, and sit down and have that hard conversation. A couple of months ago, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York invited me to do a webinar for her followers on anti-Semitism. And while we agree on a lot of things, and we're both young women from New York, we knew that on Israel, we had some very real policy disagreements. And that's precisely why she invited me, so that we could talk about the fact that despite these disagreements on Israel, we had to find a path to confront anti-Semitism and all forms of hate because our safety and our futures depended on it. And we talked about the elephants in the room. We talked about what Zionism means. We talked about how Jews hear terms like intifada, which for me, growing up during the second intifada, I think of buses and pizzerias being blown up and the cafeteria at the school I studied at in Israel being blown up, right? That's what that evokes for me. That's not necessarily what is intended by someone who's using it, but again, sitting down and leaning into these hard conversations so that we can start speaking that same language and we understand what these terms even mean to the people hearing them, whether it's Zionism or intifada or any of these other terms that have become so pervasive over the last year without any of the nuance and complexity that they deserve. And we do that so that we can ensure that the extremists of all different stripes can't divide us at a time when we need the broadest possible coalitions to protect our democracy, to protect our safety, to stand up against this deeply interconnected hate that we've been talking about for the last hour, and particularly with everything that is to come in the months and years ahead that is terrifying and frightening for so many communities. The scapegoating and the dehumanization and the rollbacks of rights. We can't let our communities and our coalitions be divided, whether it's here on campus, fighting for fundamental rights locally, fighting for civil liberties and the right to protest, and also being able to do so in a way that allows everyone to show up as their full, authentic self, whether they are Jewish and have a connection to Israel, or they are anyone else. And we need to make sure that Jews don't have to check their Jewish identity at the door in those coalitions, the same way that any other community shouldn't have to check their identity at the door. We do that by, again, leaning into those conversations and marginalizing the most extreme voices who are seeking to divide us and pit us against one another, as opposed to letting us find those points of commonality that we need to protect each and every person's rights and safety.
I would add that I think there are things that the university can do. I think there are things that campus groups can do, and I think that there are things that individuals can do. So the university, we call it CDHC, Commission on Discrimination and Hate Crimes, just launched something called Help Stop Hate. And central to it is that it's a helpline. You can report online, you can report through the phone, and we have call specialists taking calls, but it's a way for people to report when something happened to them and get support. Because people who experience acts of hate need help. I think that, so there needs to be a way to support people who've experienced hate, which is a lot of people. I think there can't be a void. We have to denounce, and the university, I think, that our institutions, our leaders, whichever communities we belong to, need to denounce hate wherever we see it. There cannot be a void. We can't accept the normalizing of hate. We are very much on the same page, even if it targets those who we deem as on the other side of issues. We have to be willing to call out hate when it's among our friends, on our side of issues. I think a lot about, one of the things that we're working on is to develop a sort of landscape of preventative programs, because we are a community with a lot of loneliness, a lot of people suffering from loneliness, and tyrants love loneliness. So, and misinformation. They target lonely people with misinformation. So one of the things I think about is sort of, can we create a web, a sort of a safety net for all of us? And what did that mean specifically is after the Buffalo attack, actually, the state of New York went to the federal government. It's possible that these programs will no longer receive funding in the next 4 years, but they created something called threat assessment and management teams.
My friend runs that program.
Really?
Yes.
And they set up these teams in every county in New York. And there are other kinds of programs like this, but the idea is that we educate teachers, librarians, clergy, parents, all the folks who encounter people, maybe therapists, the people who encounter, I think specifically, they're often talking about young people, but not only, to identify if they think somebody's getting radicalized and have the tools to intervene. I think we need to take better care of each other. And there's a lot more, there are lots of trainings, bystander training, de-escalation training. I think we need to train folks to, much like CPR. I heard someone said, not everybody can be a heart surgeon, but everybody can learn CPR so that they can treat somebody who's next to them. And I think a lot about the inner work that we each can do. A healthy society depends on our being able to live with our own pain and not externalize it. And so how can we live with uncertainty? How can we not let victimization or victimhood be the central sort of organizing principle of our lives so that we are all about grievance, which we see a lot of these days too? I would say we should be impeccable with and consistent with our commitment to stand against hate and stand with anybody who is targeted for hate. Be impeccable and consistent. I think we need to learn how to have healthy conflict, and it's really hard. And I would say the last thing is to focus on relationships. Democracy starts, this is a quote, from the assumption that the individual is important and that all types are needed to make a civilization. And the relationship between individuals, this is a quote from, I'll tell you later. The relationship between individuals are the golden threads that give the whole tapestry its shape and vibrancy. And that terror rules people who are lonely. So we are a desperately lonely society. I would say lean heavily into relationships. Text somebody, call somebody, just, do something to stay connected.
I realize we're just about out of time. I'll be very brief, and I can't. These two answers are terrific. There's very little I could say that would add much to that. I did have a 10-point program for how to address anti-Semitism and support Jewish inclusion on campus. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through all that, John. Just sort of thinking about what Amy and Ilana said, I would maybe just maybe end with where you started with these threads of belonging. And there has to be, if we really are to construct threads of belonging, there has to be a place for everyone in our university community. That has to include Jews. Yes, that has to include Zionists too. That has to include everyone, right? And we have to find ways of living and working together. Doesn't mean that we have to agree all the time. Disagreements are a healthy part of university life. I disagree with my colleagues all the time. It's one of the great things about academic life. But it does mean that we shouldn't exclude people and we shouldn't make people suffer because we disagree with them. I have been a union member for many, many years. I'm a member of the American Federation of Teachers. There's an old slogan in the labor movement, an injury to one is an injury to all. I think that applies to our DEI work as well. I think we all need to remember that.
Great. Thanks so much to the three of you for a really thoughtful conversation. Would you join me in thanking our panelists?
Really good.
Thank you.
This is when people get caught on hot mic.
Wow. We need the broadest possible coalition to protect our democracy. And that means that we need to lean into the hard conversations and not let them divide us. I'm very grateful for you all being here. This is what we needed. In fact, the entire day has been filling for us, has been energizing, particularly in such a time as this. So we really appreciate you all for all you've done and for all you've brought here today. Today we've experienced Lots of thought-provoking discussions and insightful ideas. We've seen how different voices and perspectives can come together to navigate differences and to help us build community. It's important, we just heard that we have to denounce hate wherever we see it and to take better care of each other and give each other grace. That's been a thread throughout today. Somehow, even in diversity work, we've lost the art of humanity and caring for each other. And that grace is something that is desperately needed, particularly if we're going to move forward together in community. And so I hope each of you has learned something new, has challenged yourself, has stepped out of your comfort zone. I know I was able to sit in several sessions where you feel that little thing in your stomach a little bit, but you lean into that, right? Sometimes conversations are difficult, but we know that innovation happens when we can effectively engage across difference and push ourselves out of our comfort zones. And so hopefully you've left feeling some level of inspiration, inspired. I know that I have. Prior to coming in here today, things have been hard, right? I mean, we're not going to play around with that. And but even in the lunch session and honoring Dr. Damon Williams, it sort of filled my cup. And so hopefully you all have had your cup filled today as well. Inclusive excellence is not merely a concept, right? It embodies our values of inclusion and belonging and is the foundation of strong and vibrant communities. Those kinds of communities we want to develop and ensure that our faculty, staff, and students and our community members can flourish here, right? That doesn't mean that we're always going to agree, but we can have healthy disagreement and healthy conversations. And so, thank you. Thank you all for engaging, for keeping an open mind, and for bringing your authentic selves to this space. That's it for Diversity Forum today. But once again, I encourage you to stick around tonight to celebrate the division's 15th anniversary. That's going to be at 4 o'clock in the Varsity Lounge from 4 to 6. And so I hope to see you there. But if you can't make it, that's okay too. Have a safe trip wherever you're going and enjoy your evening. And then we'll see you tomorrow. But until then, take care of yourselves and each other. On Wisconsin.